Rick Crusher Dalton was a man of imposing stature, his rugged look adding to his larger-than-life presence. He wore a weathered leather jacket, a thick beard that matched his gruff demeanor, and a smirk that rarely left his face. His gang adored him. He was their leader, the one who always had a joke up his sleeve, a reckless challenge to offer, or some way to prove that they were the toughest crew around. That afternoon, they rolled into a sleepy little town searching for a place to unwind and have a bit of fun. The sun was shining, and the streets were unusually quiet, a perfect backdrop for a little chaos. As their roaring motorcycles skidded to a halt in front of a quaint cafe, the townsfolk turned their heads. This was no usual sight for them. A group of intimidating bikers wasn't something they saw every day. A few patrons at the outdoor tables lowered their gazes, hoping the bikers would just ride on by. But Rick, as always, had other plans. He thrived on attention. He relished in making people uncomfortable, laughing loud and showing the world that no one could ever push him around. It was then that his eyes landed on something unexpected. Two impeccably groomed dogs sat outside the cafe, calm and composed. They were magnificent creatures, one a golden retriever with soft, gentle eyes, and the other a strong, well-built Doberman, poised with military precision. Rick smirked, nudging one of his friends and chuckling. "Look at these fancy little pets," he remarked. "They've probably got a better life than we do." His gang erupted in laughter. Rick had a knack for making everything about him, for making the group laugh while reminding them he was in charge. He couldn't resist the urge to test the dog's composure. Without a second thought, he lifted his boot and gave the golden retriever a gentle nudge. It wasn't enough to hurt, but enough to startle the poor dog. The retriever yelped, stumbling back, confusion and fear flashing in its eyes. The Doberman immediately rose to its feet, alert and ready to defend, but it stayed perfectly still, trained not to attack. A sudden stillness blanketed the street. The cafe patrons gasped, their moment of peace shattered. A waitress fumbled a tray, sending dishes clattering to the ground. A child, holding an ice cream cone, squeezed it so tightly that the scoop slipped and fell, unnoticed. The entire town seemed to freeze, stunned by what had just occurred. Rick, however, was pleased with himself. His gang chuckled, but their laughter faltered, unsure whether to join in. One of them murmured, maybe that wasn't such a good idea," but Rick waved it off. "It's just a dog, right? Just a little fun." What Rick didn't know, and what no one in his gang had realized, was that those dogs belonged to none other than Jason Statham. And Jason had been watching the entire scene unfold from inside the cafe. Inside, Jason sat at a small table by the window, his face sharp and unreadable, an expression that betrayed nothing, but his eyes spoke volumes. He had been enjoying the quiet peace of the town, sipping on his tea, lost in thought. The warm sunlight filtered through the glass, casting a soft glow on the wooden floors. Everything had been serene, almost perfect, until the yelp of his dog shattered the calm. His hand, mid-air with his cup, froze. His eyes shifted to the window, taking in the sight of his golden retriever recoiling in confusion, while his Doberman stood tall, guarding with alert intensity. And then his gaze locked onto the man responsible, the biker who was standing there, laughing, acting as if nothing was wrong. Jason set his cup back onto the saucer with a soft clink. The cafe owner, an elderly man with kind eyes, had witnessed the scene as well. His face drained of color as he realized the mistake that had just been made. He stepped closer to Jason, lowering his voice. "Sir, I think that biker just made a huge mistake." Jason didn't need to respond. He simply stood up, his movements smooth and deliberate. He wasn't one for shouting or making a fuss. His presence alone exuded a quiet, unshakable strength, an energy that commanded attention without a word. As he moved toward the door, the patrons inside exchanged nervous glances. They knew exactly who he was. They had seen his films, heard the whispers about his real-life combat expertise. This wasn't just some actor stepping out. This was a man who had honed his abilities over years of rigorous training. Outside, Rick's gang had stopped laughing. The atmosphere had shifted. The way the townspeople were reacting, eyes wide, almost expectant, sent a subtle shiver through the group. One of the younger bikers leaned in, whispering, "Hey, maybe we should go." Rick frowned, unbothered. Go? For what? It was just a joke. But then the air changed. A shadow moved across the pavement. The sound of boots hitting the wooden deck echoed through the silence. Jason Statham emerged from the cafe, his gaze locked onto Rick. Calm, unflinching. But beneath the calm, there was something unmistakably dangerous. Rick, for the first time that day, felt a stirring in his gut. Unease. He had been in countless scraps before, but this was different. This man, the way he moved, the way he didn't rush or react impulsively, Rick could feel it in the pit of his stomach. This wasn't just another confrontation. Jason wasn't angry. He wasn't shouting. He was about to show Rick just how wrong he'd been. Rick stood his ground, his smirk still in place, though it had faltered. The man approaching him moved with a quiet confidence, his eyes never leaving Rick's, steady and calculating. The tension in the air thickened, and the entire town seemed to hold its breath. The cafe owner lingered at the door, unsure whether to stay and watch or make a quick escape. It was clear. Something big was about to go down. Jason stopped just a few feet away from Rick, his gaze sweeping over him with calm intensity. The biker leader stood with his arms crossed, still trying to maintain his tough guy posture in front of his gang. But there was something off. A subtle shift in his stance, a stiffness in his shoulders, a hint of hesitation creeping into his movements. "You kicked my dog," Jason said, his voice low and steady, but it carried weight, like the calm before a storm. Rick scoffed, rolling his eyes. "It was just a little tap, mate." "Relax," he said, forcing a chuckle. His gang joined in, but their laughter was weaker now, uncertain. Jason's eyes didn't waver. He didn't blink. "You think it's funny?" he asked, his voice cold. Rick shrugged, trying to brush it off. "Look, I didn't mean anything by it. Just having a bit of fun." But as he spoke, the realization hit him. Every single person in town was watching. His gang was still behind him, but for the first time, Rick felt alone. Jason tilted his head, considering Rick's words. Then, without a hint of hesitation, he took one slow step closer. Rick's breath caught in his throat. There was no rage in Jason's expression, only a quiet, controlled energy that was more dangerous than any outburst of anger. "You want to have fun?" Jason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "All right, let's have some fun." Before Rick could even react, Jason moved, too fast. 1 second, Rick was standing tall. The next, he was stumbling backward, his feet suddenly failing him. Jason hadn't thrown a single punch. He had simply stepped in, tapped Rick's foot in just the right place, and swept his leg out from under him. Rick hit the ground with a loud thud, his gang gasping in disbelief. The leader, the toughest guy they all looked up to, was now flat on his back, blinking in stunned confusion. Jason didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just stood there, looking down at Rick with that same steady gaze. "Not so funny now, is it?" he asked quietly. Rick scrambled to his feet, his face flushed with embarrassment. His gang stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or stay out of it. The townspeople, on the other hand, were watching intently, some even whispering amongst themselves. It was clear they'd never witnessed anything like this before. Rick clenched his fists, trying to shake off the shock. He had been in countless brawls, but this was different. He wasn't about to let a man, especially not some actor, make a fool of him. He straightened his jacket, took a deep breath, and glared at Jason. "All right, tough guy," he growled, stepping forward. "You think you can embarrass me like that and walk away?" Jason didn't move. He remained perfectly still, his hands relaxed at his sides. His sharp eyes stayed locked on Rick's, unblinking. "You want to try again?" Jason asked, his voice calm, almost detached. Rick didn't hesitate this time. He swung his fist, aiming straight for Jason's face. But before his punch could even land, Jason moved. Quick, precise, like he had already seen it coming. He sidestepped effortlessly, grabbed Rick's wrist, and twisted it just enough to throw him off balance. In the same motion, Jason used Rick's own momentum against him, pulling him forward and sending him crashing into a nearby wooden table. The table splintered under Rick's weight, plates and cups flying everywhere. His gang stared, wide-eyed, their leader groaning on the ground. The cafe owner winced at the mess, but didn't dare say a word. Rick struggled to rise, but Jason was already standing over him, calm and collected. "Still having fun?" Jason asked, his tone unchanged. Rick gritted his teeth, forcing himself to his feet again. His pride wouldn't allow him to back down, not in front of his gang. He charged at Jason, hoping to catch him off guard. But Jason didn't flinch. With one smooth, effortless motion, Jason stepped forward and... A quick, controlled strike to Rick's chest sent him stumbling back, gasping for air. It wasn't a devastating blow, but it was enough to knock the wind out of him. Rick's hands clutched his chest as his legs turned to jelly. He had never felt so helpless in a fight before. His gang, now fully aware that their leader was completely outmatched, began to take slow, cautious steps back. Some of them couldn't even look Jason in the eye. The townspeople, however, were smiling now, quietly amused by the turn of events. Jason took another step closer, his presence looming over Rick, who was still trying to catch his breath. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't seem angry. He simply said, "You kicked my dog. Now you know how it feels." Rick's heart pounded. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just embarrassed, he was afraid. His breath was shaky as he tried to steady himself. His chest ached from the blow, and his mind raced. How was this even possible? He had been in plenty of fights before, but this was different. Jason wasn't just strong. He was fast, precise, and completely in control. The gang lingered, still too stunned to act. They had come into town thinking they were the toughest people around, but now they weren't so sure. The way Jason had handled Rick, effortlessly, without breaking a sweat, was enough to make them reconsider everything. Rick wiped the sweat from his brow, trying to regain some semblance of control. He was still the leader of this gang, and he couldn't let them see him like this. His pride wouldn't allow it. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had already lost. In a last-ditch effort, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pocket knife. With a swift flick of his wrist, he opened it, the blade gleaming in the sunlight. His grip tightened around the handle, his breathing ragged. The moment the knife appeared, the entire street went still. The townspeople took a step back, some whispering to one another. A few of them glanced toward Jason, wondering if the presence of a weapon would finally make him back down. But Jason? He didn't flinch, not an inch. He simply sighed and shook his head. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" he said, his voice steady, as calm as ever. Rick gritted his teeth. It didn't matter if Jason was some famous movie star or a martial arts expert. He couldn't back down. Not now, not in front of his gang. He had to do something. With a sudden lunge, he aimed the knife straight at Jason's side, his eyes burning with determination. But once again, Jason was faster. Before Rick could even complete the strike, Jason's hand shot forward, grabbing Rick's wrist in a vice-like grip. In one fluid motion, he twisted Rick's arm, forcing the knife from his hand with a loud clink as it hit the ground. Rick's breath caught in his throat, a sharp gasp escaping him. His wrist burned with pain, his knees buckling under the pressure. Jason tightened his grip just enough to make sure Rick understood something. He was powerless. The entire street stood in stunned silence. The gang watched, mouths agape, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. The townspeople, too, were still, some with wide eyes, others with small, knowing smiles, as if they were witnessing something that had been inevitable. Jason leaned in slightly, his voice low but loud enough for Rick to hear. "That's how it feels to be helpless," he said. "Now imagine how my dog felt." Rick couldn't respond. He didn't have the strength. He was too busy fighting to keep his hands from trembling. For a long moment, Jason held Rick's gaze, the power in his eyes unmistakable. Then, without a word, he released his wrist and took a step back. The knife lay on the ground between them, but Rick didn't even consider picking it up. He didn't want to fight anymore. Not now. Not with Jason. Rick stood there, frozen. His wrist throbbed where Jason had held it, his breath coming in heavy gasps. His mind raced. This wasn't how the day was supposed to unfold. He had come into town with his gang, expecting to show off, to have some fun, to prove he was the toughest guy in the room. Instead, he was the one being humiliated. The knife remained on the ground, but Rick couldn't bring himself to touch it. The power in Jason's grip was still fresh in his memory, the control in his every movement clear. This wasn't a fight Rick could win, not today. His gang, those same men who had laughed along with him, now looked at him with uncertainty. The fearless leader who had been the center of attention, who had always been the one in charge, was now standing there, unsure of what to do next. Jason didn't move. He didn't need to. The message had already been delivered loud and clear. He had given Rick the chance to back down, but Rick had chosen to escalate it, and now everyone in town had seen the truth. Rick wasn't as tough as he thought he was. Then, the golden retriever, the very dog Rick had kicked earlier, slowly walked up to Jason and sat beside him. The dog looked up at his owner with calm, knowing eyes, then turned to Rick as if it understood that justice had been served. Rick swallowed hard. The silence was deafening. His pride screamed at him to do something, to fight back, to prove he wasn't weak. But another part of him, the part that valued his own safety, began to speak louder. He took a slow step back, then another. His hands shook, but he did his best to hide it. The fight was over. "Let's go," Rick muttered, not bothering to look at his gang. His men hesitated, unsure of what to do next. They waited for something, maybe for their leader to do or say something. But when they saw Rick avoiding Jason's gaze, they understood. The fight had gone out of him. Their leader had given up. One by one, the bikers slowly turned and headed back toward their motorcycles. The townspeople, who had been holding their breath throughout the whole ordeal, began to relax. Some whispered amongst themselves, while others simply watched with quiet amusement, clearly enjoying the turn of events. Rick didn't even glance back as he walked toward his bike. His knife still lay forgotten on the ground. He didn't care to pick it up. All he wanted was to leave, to disappear. But just as he was about to mount his motorcycle, Jason's voice cut through the air one last time. "Next time," Jason said, his tone calm but firm. "Think before you try to prove how tough you are." Rick's jaw tightened. He didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. With a rumble, the bikers fired up their engines. The sound echoed down the street, but it wasn't the loud, proud noise they had arrived with. This time, it was a defeated roar, a sound that spoke of humiliation, of a battle lost. As they rode off, leaving behind the small town and the man who had humbled them, Rick couldn't shake the feeling that this day would stay with him. He would never forget it. As the roar of the motorcycles faded into the distance, the town slowly exhaled. A peaceful calm returned to the streets. The townsfolk who had been watching began to smile, some quietly discussing what had just happened. A few exchanged glances of admiration toward Jason, while others simply nodded, offering a silent gesture of approval. The cafe owner, who had been standing by the door, wiped his hands on his apron and chuckled. "Well," he said, shaking his head in disbelief, "that was quite a show." Jason, who had been watching the bikers disappear down the road, finally turned back toward the cafe. He reached down and gently patted his golden retriever on the head. The dog wagged its tail, content and safe. His Doberman stood alert beside him, still watching the road, ensuring the troublemakers weren't about to come back. One of the shopkeepers, an elderly woman with kind eyes, approached with a smile. "That was amazing," she said. "You didn't even have to do much, and you still taught that man a lesson he won't forget." Jason gave a small, acknowledging nod. "Some people think strength is about showing off," he replied simply. "But real strength is knowing when to use it, and when not to." The cafe owner chuckled softly. "I don't think they'll be back anytime soon," he said with a knowing look. "And if they do, well, they'll think twice before causing any trouble." Jason didn't say anything in response, but the small, knowing smile on his face spoke volumes. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Join us for more incredible tales of resilience, love, and loyalty. And as always, thank you for being part of our story.